Frances Perkins was a pioneering social reformer and a complex political figure who became one of the most influential architects of the American welfare state. Frances Perkins, the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, was born in Boston, Massachusetts on April 10, 1880. She came from a comfortable middle-class family. She had a reserved demeanor and a commitment to public service that would define her entire life. Perkins's early years were marked by intellectual curiosity and a growing awareness of social inequality. She attended Mount Holyoke College, graduating in 1902 with a degree in chemistry and physics. Her education there shaped her understanding of scientific method and rational analysis, though her later career would test those principles in the messy reality of politics and social reform. After graduating from Mount Holyoke, Perkins taught for several years at various schools, but she found teaching unfulfilling. She was drawn instead to the emerging field of social work, which promised to address the poverty and inequality she saw around her. In 1904, she moved to Chicago to work at Hull House, the famous settlement house founded by Jane Addams. It was there that Perkins first encountered the harsh realities of urban poverty and industrial exploitation. Perkins's time in Chicago was transformative. She witnessed firsthand the conditions in which immigrant workers and their families lived. She saw children working in factories, families crammed into tenement apartments, and workers injured or killed in industrial accidents with no compensation or recourse. These experiences awakened in her a passion for social reform that would drive her for the rest of her life. In 1907, Perkins moved to Philadelphia to work as the General Secretary of the Philadelphia Research and Protective Association, an organization dedicated to helping immigrant girls and women. She investigated cases of exploitation and abuse, often going undercover to gather evidence. This work was dangerous and demanding, but it gave Perkins valuable experience in investigation and advocacy. She learned how to gather facts, build cases, and pressure authorities to take action. Recognizing that she needed more formal training to be effective, Perkins enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania to study economics and sociology. She then moved to New York City in 1909 to pursue a master's degree at Columbia University. Her thesis examined malnutrition among children in Hell's Kitchen, one of New York's poorest neighborhoods. The research required her to visit tenements, interview families, and document the devastating effects of poverty on children's health. After completing her degree, Perkins became the executive secretary of the New York Consumers League, an organization that fought for better working conditions, particularly for women and children. She lobbied for legislation limiting working hours, establishing minimum wages, and improving workplace safety. She investigated factories and sweatshops, documenting violations and building support for reform legislation. On March 25, 1911, Perkins witnessed an event that would haunt her for the rest of her life and galvanize her commitment to workplace safety. She was having tea with friends near Washington Square when she heard fire engines. She rushed to the scene and found the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory engulfed in flames. She watched in horror as young women, trapped on the upper floors by locked doors, jumped to their deaths to escape the fire. 146 workers died that day, most of them young immigrant women. Perkins stood on the street and watched them fall. The Triangle Fire was a turning point in American labor history and in Perkins's life. She was determined that such a tragedy would never happen again. She threw herself into the campaign for workplace safety legislation, working with the Factory Investigating Commission established in the wake of the fire. The commission, led by State Senator Robert Wagner and Assemblyman Al Smith, conducted exhaustive investigations of working conditions throughout New York State. Perkins served as the chief investigator for the commission, visiting hundreds of factories and documenting hazardous conditions. She climbed into bakery cellars, inspected canneries, and examined the machinery in textile mills. She interviewed workers and compiled detailed reports. Her work was meticulous and her findings were damning. The evidence she gathered led to the passage of dozens of laws regulating workplace safety, limiting working hours, and protecting workers' rights. In 1913, Perkins married Paul Wilson, an economist and reformer who shared her progressive views. However, their marriage would be marked by tragedy. Wilson suffered from mental illness, experiencing episodes of depression and psychosis that required periodic hospitalization. Perkins supported him financially and emotionally throughout their marriage, even as she pursued her demanding career. They had one daughter, Susanna, born in 1916. Perkins kept her maiden name professionally, an unusual choice for the time that reflected her independent spirit. During World War I, Perkins served on various boards and commissions dealing with labor issues and industrial production. After the war, she continued her work in labor reform, becoming increasingly prominent in New York politics. In 1919, Governor Al Smith appointed her to the New York State Industrial Commission, making her the first woman to hold such a position in state government. She was responsible for enforcing labor laws and adjudicating disputes between workers and employers. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected governor of New York in 1928, he appointed Perkins as the state's industrial commissioner, the head of the labor department. She was now one of the most powerful labor officials in the country. During Roosevelt's governorship, particularly after the stock market crash of 1929, Perkins worked to develop programs to address unemployment and economic distress. She advocated for unemployment insurance, public works programs, and direct relief for the destitute. When Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, he asked Perkins to serve as Secretary of Labor. She was reluctant to accept, knowing that she would face opposition as a woman in such a prominent position. She also worried about her husband's health and her ability to care for him while serving in Washington. However, Roosevelt insisted, and Perkins felt she could not refuse the opportunity to implement reforms on a national scale. She accepted the position with one condition, that Roosevelt support her agenda for labor reform, including unemployment insurance, minimum wage laws, and the abolition of child labor. Roosevelt agreed. In March 1933, Frances Perkins became the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. It was a historic moment, though Perkins characteristically downplayed the significance of her gender, insisting that she was chosen for her competence, not as a symbol. Perkins immediately faced hostility and skepticism. Labor leaders, accustomed to dealing with men, were suspicious of her. Business leaders dismissed her as a radical. Members of Congress questioned whether a woman could handle such a demanding position. The press scrutinized her appearance, her manner, and her personal life in ways they never would have for a male cabinet member. Perkins responded to the criticism with dignity and determination. She dressed conservatively in dark dresses and tricorn hats, cultivating a serious, professional image. She worked tirelessly, often putting in 12-hour days. She built alliances with key members of Congress and labor leaders, winning them over through her knowledge and competence. As Secretary of Labor, Perkins became one of the chief architects of the New Deal, Roosevelt's program to combat the Great Depression. She was instrumental in developing and implementing many of the most important New Deal programs. She chaired the committee that drafted the Social Security Act, perhaps the most significant piece of social legislation in American history. The Social Security Act, passed in 1935, established a system of old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to dependent children and the disabled. It was a revolutionary concept in America, where such government programs had been resisted as socialist or un-American. Perkins fought for the legislation against fierce opposition from conservatives who saw it as government overreach and from some progressives who wanted more comprehensive coverage. The final bill was a compromise, but it established the principle that the government had a responsibility to protect citizens from economic insecurity. Perkins also played a key role in the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established a federal minimum wage, guaranteed overtime pay, and prohibited most child labor. She had fought for these protections for decades, and their enactment represented the culmination of her life's work. The legislation faced intense opposition from business interests and from Southern Democrats who feared it would disrupt the low-wage economy of the South. Perkins worked tirelessly to build support for the bill, testifying before Congress, negotiating with opponents, and rallying public opinion. Throughout the 1930s, Perkins dealt with numerous labor crises. She mediated strikes, investigated labor disputes, and worked to maintain industrial peace during a period of intense labor unrest. The rise of industrial unions, particularly the Congress of Industrial Organizations, created conflicts between workers and employers and between different factions of the labor movement. Perkins tried to remain neutral and to protect workers' rights while maintaining economic stability. Her relationship with labor leaders was often contentious. Many union leaders, particularly John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers, viewed her as too cautious and too willing to compromise with business interests. They wanted a Secretary of Labor who would be an unequivocal advocate for unions. Perkins, however, saw her role as serving all workers, not just union members. She believed in collective bargaining and workers' rights, but she also believed in the rule of law and the need for economic stability. In 1939, Perkins became embroiled in a major controversy involving Harry Bridges, a radical labor leader and head of the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union. Bridges, who was born in Australia, was accused of being a communist, and there were demands that he be deported. The House of Representatives held hearings and voted to impeach Perkins for refusing to deport Bridges without proper legal proceedings. Perkins insisted that Bridges was entitled to due process and that she would not deport anyone based on political beliefs without clear evidence of illegal activity. The impeachment effort ultimately failed, but the controversy damaged Perkins's reputation and highlighted the growing anti-communist sentiment in America. The Bridges case revealed Perkins's commitment to civil liberties and the rule of law, even when it was politically unpopular. When World War II began, Perkins faced new challenges. The war created massive demand for labor and brought millions of women into the workforce. Perkins worked to ensure that these new workers were treated fairly and that labor standards were maintained despite the pressures of wartime production. She also dealt with labor disputes that threatened war production, mediating between unions and management to prevent strikes. However, by the early 1940s, Perkins's influence was waning. Roosevelt increasingly turned to other advisors on labor issues. There were calls for her resignation from both labor leaders and conservatives. Some felt she had been in office too long and had become ineffective. Others simply wanted her removed because of her gender or her liberal views. After Roosevelt's death in April 1945, President Harry Truman asked Perkins to remain as Secretary of Labor, but she declined. She had served for 12 years, longer than any other labor secretary before or since. She was exhausted and eager to step down. However, Truman persuaded her to accept an appointment to the Civil Service Commission, where she served until 1953. In her later years, Perkins remained active in public life. She taught at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations, where she was a popular lecturer. She wrote a memoir of her time in the Roosevelt administration, The Roosevelt I Knew, which was published in 1946 and became a bestseller. The book provided an insider's view of the New Deal and offered warm, personal portraits of Roosevelt and other New Deal figures. Perkins also traveled extensively, giving lectures on labor issues and social policy. She was in demand as a speaker and consultant, and she used her prominence to advocate for continued social reform. She supported the expansion of Social Security, increases in the minimum wage, and improved workplace safety regulations. She remained committed to the principles that had guided her throughout her career, that government had a responsibility to protect the vulnerable, that workers deserved dignity and fair treatment, and that economic security was a fundamental right. Throughout her post-cabinet years, Perkins dealt with ongoing family difficulties. Her husband's mental illness had worsened over the years, and he required permanent institutionalization. Perkins visited him regularly and continued to support him financially until his death in 1952. She rarely spoke publicly about her personal struggles, maintaining the privacy and dignity that had always characterized her approach to life. Perkins's legacy was complex and sometimes controversial. She had been instrumental in creating the American welfare state, but she had also made compromises that disappointed some progressives. The Social Security Act, for example, initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, many of whom were African American. This exclusion was necessary to gain Southern support for the legislation, but it meant that millions of workers were left without protection. Perkins defended these compromises as necessary to achieve progress, but critics argued that they perpetuated racial inequality. Similarly, her cautious approach to labor disputes and her insistence on legal procedures sometimes frustrated union leaders who wanted more aggressive advocacy. Perkins believed in working within the system, building coalitions, and achieving incremental progress. This approach achieved significant results, but it also meant accepting limitations and making compromises. On May 14, 1965, Frances Perkins died in New York City at the age of 85. She had lived long enough to see the expansion of many of the programs she had helped create. Social Security had become an integral part of American life. The minimum wage had been raised several times. Child labor had been virtually eliminated. Workplace safety had improved dramatically. The New Deal's legacy was secure, and Perkins had played a crucial role in building it. Perkins's funeral was attended by labor leaders, politicians, and social reformers. She was buried in Newcastle, Maine, where her family had roots. In death, as in life, Perkins was remembered as a dedicated public servant who had devoted her life to helping others. Modern historians have recognized Perkins as one of the most important figures in 20th century American history. She was a pioneer who broke gender barriers and proved that women could serve effectively in the highest levels of government. She was an architect of the welfare state who helped transform the relationship between government and citizens. She was a tireless advocate for workers who spent her entire career fighting for dignity, safety, and economic security for working people. Yet Perkins remains less well-known than many of her male contemporaries. She is often overlooked in histories of the New Deal, overshadowed by Roosevelt and other more prominent figures. This obscurity reflects both her own self-effacing nature and the historical tendency to minimize women's contributions to public life. Perkins herself would likely have been unconcerned about her place in history. She was never interested in personal glory or recognition. She saw herself as a public servant doing necessary work. When asked about being the first woman in the cabinet, she typically responded that she hoped she wouldn't be the last, but that what mattered was the work, not the person doing it. This humility was genuine, but it also reflected the constraints she faced as a woman in a male-dominated world. She had to constantly prove that she was serious, competent, and focused on substance rather than symbolism. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Frances Perkins comes from those who worked with her. They consistently described her as brilliant, tireless, and utterly committed to her principles. She was not always easy to work with. She could be stubborn, demanding, and unwilling to compromise on matters of principle. But she was also fair, honest, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of ordinary people. Perkins represents a particular type of political leader, the dedicated reformer who works within the system to achieve progressive change. She was not a revolutionary. She did not seek to overthrow capitalism or fundamentally restructure American society. Instead, she worked to make capitalism more humane, to protect workers from exploitation, and to ensure that economic growth benefited everyone, not just the wealthy. This approach achieved remarkable results, creating programs and protections that have benefited millions of Americans. In the end, Frances Perkins was a woman of extraordinary accomplishment who helped build the foundation of modern American social policy. Her legacy includes Social Security, unemployment insurance, the minimum wage, and countless other protections that Americans now take for granted. She proved that women could serve effectively in positions of power and that government could be a force for good in people's lives. She is remembered today as a pioneer, a reformer, and a public servant who dedicated her life to making America more just and equitable for all its citizens.